Good evening all and welcome back to Paranoia Files. Tonight I bring you 8 of the most disturbing true Halloween horror stories ever shared. These are not tales spun from imagination or borrowed from folklore, but real accounts from individuals who experienced the unthinkable on the one night when darkness holds dominion. From rituals witnessed in forbidden places to encounters with entities that defy all logic. From evil that wears a human face to curses that follow families across generations. Each story will test the very limits of what you believe is possible. These testimonies have been carefully documented and verified through multiple witnesses, preserved exactly as they were told, though certain names and specific locations have been altered to protect those who lived through these terrors. If you have not yet subscribed to Paranoia Files, do so now and activate your notification bell so you never miss another descent into the unknown. Leave a comment below sharing your own Halloween experiences or tell me which story disturbed you the most tonight. The narrator's father and uncle never spoke openly about what they witnessed on Halloween night in 1992. For years, the story existed only in fragments, whispered during family gatherings when the lights were low and the children had gone to bed. It was not until the narrator reached adulthood that the full account finally emerged. And even then, it came reluctantly, as though speaking the words aloud might invite something terrible back into their lives. The family lived in a remote part of northern New Mexico at that time, on the edge of a Navajo reservation where the narrator's grandmother taught at the local school. She was a formidable woman, educated and practical, the kind of person who dismissed superstition with a wave of her hand and insisted that every mystery had a rational explanation. The father and uncle were young then, 14 and 12 respectively, caught in that awkward age between childhood and adolescence when the world still held magic. But logic had begun to intrude. Their house sat in a valley surrounded by mesas that rose like sleeping giants against the horizon. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, dotted with scrub brush and juniper trees, broken only by the occasional dirt road that connected one isolated home to another. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, the kind of beauty that reminded a person how small they were in the grand scheme of things. The boys had grown accustomed to the silence out there, the way sound carried for miles across the empty desert, the way darkness fell absolute and complete when the sun finally surrendered to the western edge of the world. Halloween arrived with unseasonable warmth that year. The afternoon sun had beaten down mercilessly, baking the red earth until it cracked and sending heat waves shimmering across the valley floor. As evening approached, the temperature dropped rapidly, as it always did in the desert, and the boys decided to take advantage of the cooling air. They grabbed their bicycles and set out along the dusty trails that wound through the scattered homes of their neighbors, most of whom were Navajo families who had lived on that land for generations. The father recalled how peaceful everything seemed at first. They rode past the home of a boy named Joseph, who sometimes joined them on their adventures and convinced him to come along. Joseph's younger brother Daniel tagged along as well, eager to be included in whatever mischief the older boys might find. The 4 of them cycled together as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that seemed almost violent in their intensity. They had been riding for perhaps an hour when the father noticed something strange on top of the mesa that loomed to the north of their property. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, that the failing light had created some kind of optical illusion. But as he squinted into the distance, he realized what he was seeing was real. An enormous fire blazed atop the mesa, flames leaping impossibly high into the darkening sky, far larger than any bonfire the father had ever seen. He called out to his uncle and pointed toward the mesa. His uncle stopped his bicycle and stared, mouth falling open. Joseph and Daniel pulled up beside them, and the father watched as both boys went rigid with fear. The fire raged with unnatural intensity, and silhouetted against the flames was a figure, pitch black and completely featureless, dancing around the blaze in movements that were wrong in ways the father could not articulate. The figure moved too fluidly, its limbs bending at angles that human joints could not achieve, spinning and leaping with a grace that seemed almost mocking. The father turned to Joseph, intending to ask what they were witnessing, but the words died in his throat. Joseph had gone pale, his eyes wide and fixed on the mesa. Daniel had begun to shake, his hands gripping the handlebars of his bicycle so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Neither boy spoke. Without a word, both of them turned their bicycles around and began pedaling back toward their home with desperate speed, leaving the father and uncle standing alone on the trail. The uncle looked at the father with confusion written across his face. "What was that about?" he asked. The father shook his head, unable to answer. They both turned back to the mesa, watching as the figure continued its disturbing dance around the fire. The flames had grown even higher now, reaching toward the sky with fingers of orange and red. And the father could have sworn he heard something on the wind, a sound like chanting or singing, though the mesa was at least 2 miles away, and there should have been no way for sound to carry that far. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, transfixed by the impossible scene playing out before them. The father felt a cold dread settling into his stomach, a primal fear that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to something ancient in his brain. The part that still remembered when humans were prey and darkness held real threats. Finally, the uncle broke the spell by suggesting they head home and tell their grandmother what they had seen. Surely she would know what to make of it. They rode back to the house in silence, both boys pedaling faster than necessary, as though something might be following them through the gathering darkness. When they burst through the front door, breathless and agitated, the grandmother looked up from the book she had been reading with mild annoyance. She listened as the father described the fire and the dancing figure, her expression growing more skeptical with each word. When he finished, she set her book aside and fixed him with the kind of look that suggested she was disappointed in his foolishness. "It was probably just some teenagers having a party," she said. "The light can play tricks on the eyes, especially at dusk." The father protested, insisting that what they had seen was not natural, that Joseph and Daniel had fled in terror the moment they spotted the fire. The grandmother's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Those boys are steeped in old superstitions," she explained. "Their families fill their heads with stories about skinwalkers and witches, and they see danger in every shadow. It is a cultural thing," she said, "something outsiders like us cannot fully understand. But that does not make it real." The uncle asked if they could at least drive up to the mesa to investigate, but the grandmother refused. It was getting dark, she pointed out, and the dirt roads that led to the top of the mesa were treacherous even in daylight. If the father and uncle were still curious in the morning, she would allow them to hike up and see for themselves that there was nothing to fear. With that, she returned to her book, making it clear that the discussion was over. The father barely slept that night. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the desert outside his window. Every creak of the house settling, every gust of wind that rattled the shutters, every distant howl of a coyote made him jump. He kept seeing that figure in his mind, the way it had moved around the fire with inhuman fluidity, and he could not shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with what they had witnessed. Morning arrived with cruel slowness. As soon as the sun cleared the horizon, the father and uncle were up and dressed, eager to solve the mystery that had kept them awake. The grandmother made them eat breakfast first, refusing to let them leave until they had finished their eggs and toast, and by the time they finally set out, the morning was already growing warm. The hike to the top of the mesa took nearly an hour. The terrain was rough, covered in loose rocks that shifted under their feet and thorny bushes that snagged at their clothes. As they climbed higher, the father found himself growing nervous, though he could not say why. The sky was clear and blue, the sun was shining, and birds sang in the scattered trees. Everything appeared normal and peaceful. Yet something felt off, as though the very air around them was holding its breath. When they finally reached the summit, both boys stopped and stared in disbelief. The top of the mesa was exactly as it always had been. Red earth and scattered rocks, patches of dried grass, a few stunted juniper trees clinging to life in the harsh environment. There was no sign of a fire. No blackened ground, no ash, no burnt wood. Nothing. The father walked to the spot where he was certain the blaze had been, dropping to his knees to examine the earth more closely. The ground was not even warm. It was as though the fire had never existed at all. The uncle suggested that maybe they had been looking at a different mesa, that in the fading light they had gotten confused about the location. But the father knew better. He had lived in that valley for 3 years. He knew every mesa, every rock formation, every landmark. This was definitely the right place. They searched the entire summit, looking for any evidence that someone had been there the night before, but they found nothing. Not a footprint, not a cigarette butt, not a single indication that another human being had set foot on that mesa in weeks or possibly months. They returned home, confused and unsettled. The grandmother listened to their report with an expression of vindication, nodding as though their findings had confirmed exactly what she had expected. "You see," she said, "it was just a trick of the light. Your imaginations ran away with you." The father wanted to argue, but what could he say? The evidence supported her explanation, or rather the lack of evidence did. Over the next few days, the father tried to speak with Joseph and Daniel about what they had seen, but both boys refused to discuss it. When the father approached Joseph at school, his friend turned and walked away without a word. When he went to their house and knocked on the door, Joseph's mother answered with a tight smile and said the boys were not home, though the father could see Joseph watching from a window. Daniel would not even make eye contact with him anymore, crossing to the other side of the hallway whenever they passed in school. The entire Navajo community seemed to have closed ranks. Adults who had previously been friendly now offered only curt nods of acknowledgement. Conversations would stop abruptly when the father or uncle approached. Even the grandmother noticed the change, though she attributed it to cultural misunderstanding rather than anything sinister. "They are a private people," she explained. "They do not appreciate outsiders prying into their beliefs and traditions." Months passed, then years. The family eventually moved away from the reservation, and life continued. The incident faded into memory, becoming one of those strange experiences that defies explanation, but ultimately gets filed away under things that cannot be understood. The father and uncle occasionally brought it up with each other, usually late at night after a few drinks, but they never reached any conclusions. It remained a mystery, unsettling but distant. It was not until the narrator was in college that they first heard the term skinwalker. They were taking an anthropology course that touched on Native American folklore, and the professor mentioned the Navajo belief in witches who could transform into animals and perform dark magic. The description sent a chill down the narrator's spine, and that evening they called their father and asked him to tell the story again, in full detail this time, leaving nothing out. As the father recounted the tale, the narrator listened with growing unease. When he finished, there was a long silence on the line. Finally, the narrator asked the question that had been forming in their mind throughout the conversation. "Dad, do you think it was a skinwalker?" The father was quiet for a moment before answering. "I do not know what it was," he said slowly, "but I know what I saw. And I know that Joseph and Daniel recognized it immediately. They knew what they were looking at, and it terrified them. Years later, the narrator decided to visit the reservation and see the mesa for themselves. They drove out to New Mexico, following directions their father had provided until they found the old house where the family had lived. It was abandoned now, windows broken and roof sagging, slowly being reclaimed by the desert. The narrator parked and got out, shielding their eyes against the sun as they looked north toward the mesa. Even from a distance, even in broad daylight, something about that mesa felt wrong. The narrator could not explain it rationally. It was just a geological formation, no different from dozens of others scattered across the landscape. But standing there looking at it, the narrator felt a heaviness in their chest, a sense of oppression that made it difficult to breathe. The air seemed thicker somehow, as though darkness had seeped into the very fabric of that place and refused to leave. The narrator did not hike to the summit. Some part of them, the part that still listens to instinct over logic, knew that going up there would be a mistake. Instead, they got back in their car and drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror as the mesa grew smaller behind them. To this day, the narrator cannot explain what their father and uncle witnessed that Halloween night in 1992, but they know with absolute certainty that something happened on top of that mesa. Something that left no physical evidence but burned itself into the memory of everyone who saw it. And sometimes late at night, when sleep will not come, the narrator wonders if that figure is still up there, dancing around fires that leave no ash, waiting for the next person foolish enough to watch. Halloween has always held a particular dread for the narrator's father, though he never explained why until the narrator was well into their 20s. The father had worked as a trail guide in Central California during the late 1970s, leading tourists and amateur hikers through the wilderness areas that stretched for hundreds of miles through the Sierra Nevada foothills. It was good work for a young man who loved the outdoors, and the father had taken pride in his knowledge of the land, his ability to read weather patterns and animal signs, his skill at keeping groups safe in environments that could turn deadly without warning. The guiding company was small, family-owned, employing perhaps a dozen guides during peak season. Most of them were local men who had grown up in those mountains and knew every trail, every water source, every cave and overlook. They were a tight-knit group, the kind of men who could communicate with glances and gestures, who trusted each other implicitly when lives depended on split-second decisions. The father's uncle worked there as well, having gotten the father the job in the first place, and the two of them often led tours together, falling into an easy rhythm that came from years of shared experience. In October of 1978, a new guide joined their crew. His name was Carl, though he introduced himself simply as C to most people, and he was unlike anyone the father had encountered before. Carl was Native American, from which tribe the father never learned, and he carried himself with a quiet intensity that suggested he was running from something. He never spoke about his past, never mentioned family or friends, never explained why he had shown up at the guiding company with nothing but a backpack and a desperate need for work. The owner hired him anyway, perhaps sensing that Carl was the kind of man who would rather die than let someone down. Carl was an exceptional guide. He moved through the wilderness with an ease that made it look like he had been born in those mountains, reading the land with an instinct that went beyond training or experience. He could predict weather changes hours before they arrived, find water in places where the other guides saw only dry earth, navigate by stars and landmarks with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. The father respected him immediately, and over the weeks that followed, a cautious friendship developed between them. But there was something haunted about Carl. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it never quite reached his eyes. He slept poorly, often waking in the night with a gasp, sitting up in his bedroll and staring into the darkness as though searching for something just beyond the firelight. He was hyper-vigilant in ways that went beyond normal caution, always positioning himself so he could see in all directions. Always the last to sleep and the first to wake. The other guides noticed but said nothing. Everyone had their demons, and in that line of work, no one pried. The incident occurred on Halloween night during what was supposed to be a routine 3-day excursion. The father, his uncle Carl, and 2 other guides named Marcus and Tom were leading a group of 8 tourists through a particularly remote section of wilderness. The plan was to camp that night near a small lake, spend the following day exploring the surrounding area, then return to civilization on the 3rd day. It was a trip they had done dozens of times before, easy terrain, low risk, perfect for the amateur outdoorsmen who made up most of their clientele. They reached the lake around 4 in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western ridges. The guides set up camp with practiced efficiency while the tourists wandered around taking photographs and marveling at the isolation. The father remembered thinking how perfect everything seemed, how the autumn light painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber, how the air smelled of pine and clean water. There was no indication that anything was wrong. Dinner was a communal affair. Everyone gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter. The tourists were in high spirits, excited by the adventure and the novelty of sleeping under the stars. The guides entertained them with tales of previous expeditions, carefully edited versions that emphasized the beauty of nature while downplaying the actual dangers. Carl sat slightly apart from the group, eating in silence, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Around 8 o'clock, one of the tourists pointed into the distance and asked what kind of animal that was. The father followed his gaze and saw what appeared to be a coyote standing perhaps 100 yards away, just visible in the fading light. He raised his binoculars and focused on the creature, intending to give the tourists a brief lesson on local wildlife, but what he saw made him pause. The animal was shaped like a coyote, roughly the right size and color, but something about its proportions seemed off. Its legs were too long, its body too narrow, and its movements as it walked were wrong in a way the father could not immediately identify. The father lowered his binoculars and glanced at his uncle, who was also watching the creature with a confused expression. "It is walking weird," the uncle murmured. The father nodded, raising the binoculars again. The animal was moving with a strange, loping gait that reminded him more of a camel than a canine, its spine undulating in a way that defied the normal mechanics of quadrupedal locomotion. He was about to comment on this when he noticed Carl. The guide had gone completely rigid, his face drained of color, his eyes locked on the distant creature with an expression of absolute terror. His hands trembled as he slowly set down his plate, and the father could see that he had stopped breathing. The transformation was so dramatic that several of the tourists noticed, their conversations trailing off as they turned to stare at Carl with concern. Before anyone could ask what was wrong, the creature moved. It burst from its position with explosive speed, closing the 100-yard distance in seconds, moving in that same bizarre, undulating manner that made the father's stomach turn. It ran directly onto the trail between the campsite and the lake, and then it stopped. And then it stood up. The father would never forget that moment. The creature rose onto its hind legs with fluid grace, balancing perfectly upright as though standing on 2 legs was its natural state. It was tall, easily 6 feet, with front limbs that now hung at its sides like arms. And then it turned toward the campsite and smiled. It smiled with a full human grin, lips pulled back to reveal teeth that were stained brown and filed to points, a smile that held nothing but malice and hunger and something the father could only describe as cruel amusement. The campsite erupted in chaos. The tourists scrambled backward, some screaming, others frozen in shock. Marcus and Tom shouted questions that no one could answer. The uncle grabbed the father's arm, his grip tight enough to bruise, but Carl moved with purpose. He reached into his pack and pulled out a wooden disc, perhaps 6 inches in diameter, with a symbol burnt into its surface that looked like an arrow broken in the middle. He held it up toward the creature, his hand shaking but his voice steady as he spoke words in a language the father did not recognize. The creature's smile widened impossibly further, and then it opened its mouth and screamed. The sound was unlike anything the father had ever heard, a howling shriek that seemed to contain multiple voices layered over each other, all of them wrong, all of them drowning. It was the sound of someone screaming underwater, gargled and wet and filled with rage. The creature held the scream for several seconds, its body rigid, its eyes fixed on Carl, and then it dropped back onto 4 legs and vanished into the tree line. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the ragged breathing of 12 terrified people trying to process what they had just witnessed. Finally, Marcus broke the silence by demanding to know what the hell that thing was. Carl did not answer. He stood staring at the spot where the creature had disappeared, the wooden disc still clutched in his hand, his entire body trembling. The father approached him carefully, speaking in a low voice, asking if Carl was all right. The guide turned to look at him, and the father saw something in his eyes that frightened him almost as much as the creature had. It was the look of a man who had been running for a very long time and had just realized that whatever he was running from had finally caught up. The tourists demanded to leave immediately, to pack up camp and hike back to civilization in the dark. Tom and Marcus agreed, arguing that staying in that location was insane after what they had just seen. But Carl shook his head. "We cannot move at night," he said quietly. "Not now. Not with that thing out there." His voice carried such certainty that the argument died. They would stay at the camp, keep the fire burning high, keep watch and shifts, and leave at first light. It was the longest night of the father's life. They organized into 2-hour watch shifts, 3 people awake at all times while the others attempted to sleep. No one actually slept. They lay in their bedrolls staring at the darkness beyond the firelight, listening to every sound, interpreting every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs as evidence that the creature was circling them. The father took the first watch with his uncle and Carl, sitting with their backs to the fire, scanning the tree line with flashlights that seemed pitifully inadequate. Around midnight, Carl finally spoke. He told them that he had been part of a research team 2 years earlier, a group of anthropologists and biologists studying wildlife patterns in a remote area of Arizona. There had been 5 of them living in a base camp for 3 months, documenting animal behavior and collecting samples. They had started noticing strange things after the first few weeks. Equipment would go missing and then reappear in different locations. They would hear voices calling their names from the darkness, voices that sounded exactly like their colleagues even when all 5 of them were accounted for. Animals would approach the camp and watch them with an intelligence that seemed unnatural. Then people started dying. The first was a woman named Sarah, found torn apart 100 yards from camp, her body positioned in a way that suggested she had been arranged deliberately. The second was a man named David who disappeared during a supply run and was discovered 3 days later, his skin removed with surgical precision. The authorities called it animal attacks, probably a mountain lion, but Carl knew better. They all knew better. Something was hunting them, something that enjoyed the fear and the suffering, something that wanted them to know they were being stalked. Carl and one other researcher, a man named Thomas, had fled the camp and made their way back to civilization. Thomas had gone to stay with family in the Midwest, while Carl had kept moving, taking jobs in different states, never staying in one place long enough for anything to find him. He had thought he was safe. He had thought that by keeping moving, by staying vigilant, he could outrun whatever was following him. but when he saw that creature tonight, when he saw the way it looked directly at him and smiled, he knew that it had been tracking him all along. It had simply been waiting for the right moment. The wooden disc, Carl explained, had been given to him by a Navajo elder he had met during his research days. The old man had warned him that there were things in the wilderness that predated humanity. Things that wore the shapes of animals but were not animals. Things that hunted for sport and fed on fear. The disc was protection, a ward that could drive such creatures away, but its power was limited. It would work once, maybe twice, but eventually the creature would learn to ignore it. Carl looked at the father and his uncle with eyes that had given up hope. "It found me," he said simply. "I do not know how, but it found me. And it will not stop until I am dead." The father asked what they could do, how they could help, but Carl just shook his head. "You cannot help," he said. "The best thing you can do is stay away from me after tonight. Whatever this thing is, it is focused on me. As long as you are not with me, you should be safe." Dawn arrived with agonizing slowness. As soon as there was enough light to see by, they broke camp and began the hike back. Carl led them on a different route than they had used to arrive, taking them through more difficult terrain but keeping them in open areas where visibility was good. They moved quickly, the tourists too frightened to complain about the pace, the guides too on edge to make small talk. Every shadow seemed to hold threat. Every bird call sounded like a warning. They reached civilization around noon, emerging from the wilderness into a parking area where their vehicles waited. The tourists practically ran to their cars, desperate to put distance between themselves and whatever they had encountered. Tom and Marcus immediately went to the owner's office to file a report, though the father knew no official report would ever reflect the truth of what they had seen. His uncle went with them, leaving the father alone with Carl. The father offered to let Carl stay with him, suggested they contact the authorities or find someone who specialized in this kind of thing. But Carl refused. He packed his belongings into his backpack, the same pack he had arrived with months earlier, and pulled out several wooden discs identical to the one he had used the night before. He pressed them into the father's hands, along with one for his uncle, and made him promise to keep them close. "Just in case," Carl said. "Just in case it decides that anyone who helped me is also a target." The father asked where Carl was going, what he was planning to do, but Carl just smiled sadly and said he was going somewhere isolated, somewhere far from people where if the thing finally caught him, no one else would be hurt. The father tried to argue, but Carl was already walking away, backpack over his shoulder, moving with that same quiet intensity that had characterized him from the first day they met. That was the last time the father saw Carl. He made inquiries over the following weeks, contacted other guiding companies and rangers in different states, but no one had seen or heard from him. It was as though Carl had simply vanished into the wilderness, swallowed up by the very land he had navigated so skillfully. The father kept the wooden disc, storing it in a box in his closet where it remained for decades. The narrator asked to see it once years later, and the father reluctantly retrieved the box. The disc was exactly as Carl had described, about 6 inches across, made from some dark wood the narrator did not recognize, with a burnt arrow symbol broken in the middle. The father held it carefully, almost reverently, and told the narrator that he had never needed to use it. Whatever had been hunting Carl had apparently been satisfied with that single encounter, that single moment of acknowledgement. Or perhaps it had found Carl in the end and no longer needed to pursue anyone else. To this day, the father refuses to go into the wilderness on Halloween. He stays home with the doors locked and the lights on, the wooden disc within reach, just in case. Because he remembers the way that creature smiled, the way it looked at Carl with recognition and anticipation. And he knows with absolute certainty that there are things in the darkness that wear familiar shapes, but are not what they seem. Things that hunt not for food, but for the joy of causing fear. Things that smile with human teeth and know exactly what that smile means to the people watching. And sometimes, late at night, the father wonders if Carl is still out there somewhere, still running, still trying to stay one step ahead of the thing that will not stop hunting until it finally brings him down. The narrator has always been careful about what they share regarding the events of Halloween night in 2018. Not because they doubt what happened, but because speaking about it feels dangerous in ways that are difficult to articulate. There is a superstition common among many indigenous cultures that discussing certain encounters can invite them to return. The narrator has tried to honor that belief, keeping the details locked away, mentioned only in whispers to people they trust completely. But the memory refuses to fade, and perhaps there is value in testimony, in creating a record of what exists in the spaces between our understanding and our denial. The narrator was 23 years old at Halloween, living with their parents in a rural area of northern Idaho where houses were separated by acres of dense forest, and the nearest neighbor was far enough away that screaming would accomplish nothing. The property itself was substantial, nearly 15 acres, most of it wild woodland that pressed against the boundaries of the cleared land surrounding the house. The narrator's father had purchased the property years earlier specifically for its isolation, craving the kind of peace that only true remoteness could provide. The narrator had grown up there, had spent their childhood exploring those woods and knew every trail and clearing within a mile of the house. The narrator's boyfriend at the time, a young man named Michael, had driven up from Boise to spend the weekend. They had been dating for 8 months, and the relationship had reached that comfortable stage where silence was as easy as conversation. Michael was practical and skeptical, the kind of person who demanded evidence before accepting claims, who rolled his eyes at ghost stories and dismissed superstition as intellectual weakness. The narrator had always appreciated that about him, the way his rationality balanced against their own tendency toward anxiety and imagination. Halloween had arrived cold and moonless that year. The temperature had dropped into the low 20s by evening, unusual even for Idaho in late October, and a thick frost had settled over everything, making the world look crystalline and fragile. The narrator and Michael had spent the evening watching horror movies, appropriately enough curled together on the couch while the narrator's father worked in his study upstairs. Around 11 o'clock, Michael announced he needed to leave, that he had an early shift the next morning and the drive back to Boise would take nearly 3 hours. The narrator walked him outside, as they always did, intending to say goodnight at his car and then hurry back into the warmth of the house. But as they stepped off the porch, both of them stopped simultaneously. Something felt wrong. The narrator could not identify what specifically had changed, but the air itself seemed different, heavier somehow, charged with a tension that made the hair on the back of their neck stand up. Michael felt it too. The narrator could tell from the way his posture changed, the way his hand instinctively found theirs and squeezed. They stood there for a moment in silence, breath-forming clouds in the freezing air, listening to the absolute quiet that surrounded them. No wind, no animal sounds, no distant traffic noise. Just silence so complete it felt oppressive. Then Michael pointed toward the end of the driveway, toward the streetlight that marked where their property met the rural road, and whispered a single word. "Look." The narrator followed his gesture and saw what appeared at first glance to be a deer standing beneath the streetlight. The property backed up against national forest land, and deer were common visitors, often grazing in the front yard or crossing the driveway at dusk. But as the narrator focused on the figure, they realized it was not a deer. It was not anything they could readily identify. The creature stood roughly 6 to 7 feet tall, built like a wolf but wrong in fundamental ways that made the narrator's brain reject what their eyes were reporting. It was entirely black, Not the dark brown or gray of normal wolves, but a black so absolute it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its body was elongated and emaciated, ribs visible even from that distance. But it held itself upright, balanced on its hind legs in a way that was grotesquely unnatural. And rising from its head was a pair of antlers, massive and complex, the kind of rack that belonged on a fully mature elk, not on a canine predator. But it was the eyes that truly terrified the narrator. Even from 70 or 80 feet away, even in the poor lighting provided by the single street light, the narrator could see that the creature's eyes glowed. Not reflected light, the way animal eyes shine when caught by headlights, but actual illumination, as though something inside the creature was burning. The eyes were blood red, bright and terrible, and they were staring directly at the narrator and Michael with an intensity that suggested intelligence and purpose. The narrator tried to move, tried to step backward toward the house, but their body would not respond. They were frozen completely, every muscle locked, as though they had become a statue. Beside them, Michael had gone equally rigid, his hands still gripping the narrator's butt, unmoving, his breathing shallow and rapid. The narrator's mind screamed at their legs to run, at their arms to push Michael toward safety, but the commands went unheeded. They could only stand there, paralyzed, while the creature watched them with those burning red eyes. Time became elastic. The narrator could not say if they stood there for seconds or minutes or hours. Their entire world had narrowed to the creature and those eyes, and nothing else existed. Peripherally, they were aware of the cold seeping through their clothes, of Michael's hand becoming painful in theirs, of their own heart hammering so violently they thought it might burst. But these sensations were distant, unimportant compared to the overwhelming presence of the thing that held them captive with its gaze. The spell broke suddenly. The front door of the house opened and the narrator's father stepped out, calling their name with concern in his voice. The moment his words cut through the silence, the narrator felt control return to their body like a switch being flipped. The creature reacted instantly, dropping from its upright position onto all fours, and then it moved. It did not run like a dog or a wolf. It moved like a cat, low to the ground and fluid, its spine undulating in a way that defied skeletal mechanics, and with terrifying speed it vanished into the woods on the opposite side of the road. The narrator stumbled backward, nearly falling, dragging Michael with them. Their father rushed down the porch steps, demanding to know what was wrong, what had happened. The narrator tried to explain, words tumbling over each other incoherently, gesturing toward the streetlight and the woods beyond. Michael said nothing, his face drained of color, his eyes still fixed on the spot where the creature had disappeared. The father listened to the narrator's fractured explanation, his expression growing more serious with each word. When they finished, he walked to the end of the driveway, moving with the kind of caution that suggested he believed them completely, and examined the area beneath the streetlight. The narrator and Michael followed at a distance, neither of them willing to get too close to the place where the creature had stood. The father crouched down, studying the frost-covered asphalt, then stood and looked toward the woods. The narrator asked if he could see anything, any tracks or signs that something had been there. The father shook his head slowly. "Nothing," he said. "The frost is undisturbed. If something that size had been standing here, there would be evidence. But there is nothing." The narrator protested, insisting that they knew what they had seen, that both they and Michael had witnessed the creature clearly. The father held up a hand to stop them. "I believe you," he said firmly. "I am not suggesting you imagined it. I am telling you that whatever that thing was, it did not interact with the physical world the way normal animals do, and that makes it infinitely more dangerous." He ushered them back to the house, his hand on the small of the narrator's back, moving them quickly but without panic. Michael got into his car and the father instructed him to drive directly to the main highway without stopping, to keep his doors locked and his speed up, and to call when he reached Boise to confirm he had arrived safely. Michael nodded, still too shaken to speak, and pulled out of the driveway faster than was probably safe on the frost-slicked surface. Inside the house, the father locked all the doors and closed all the curtains, then went to his study and returned with a laptop. He pulled up the security camera feeds and the narrator realized they had completely forgotten about the cameras. Their father had installed a comprehensive system 2 years earlier. Motion-activated cameras with night vision and thermal imaging capabilities positioned around the entire property. If the creature had been there, the cameras would have captured it. The father navigated to the camera that covered the front driveway and the streetlight, selected the timestamp corresponding to 15 minutes earlier, and played the footage. The narrator watched the screen with mounting dread as the recording showed themselves and Michael walking out of the house and standing in the driveway. The thermal imaging displayed them as bright yellow and orange figures, clearly visible against the blue-green background of the cold environment. They stood there for several seconds, obviously looking at something. And then the narrator saw themselves try to move backward, saw the way their body jerked as though fighting against restraint. But there was nothing else in the frame. No creature, no heat signature, nothing but empty driveway and the pool of light beneath the streetlight. Even when the creature should have fled into the woods, there was no movement, no thermal trace, nothing that would indicate a large mammal had been present. The narrator watched themselves stumble backward as the father appeared, watched Michael's terrified posture, watched all three of them walk to the end of the driveway and examine the ground. The video was clear and unambiguous. They had been reacting to something, but that something had left no evidence of its existence. The father stopped the playback and looked at the narrator. "What you saw tonight was real," he said carefully. "I can see from the video that you were genuinely terrified, that you were paralyzed, that something was there. But whatever it was, it exists outside normal physical parameters. It does not generate heat, it does not leave tracks, and it can freeze people in place with eye contact alone. Do you understand what that means?" The narrator shook their head, still trying to process the absence of evidence for something they had seen so clearly. The father leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. "When I was younger," he said, "I worked on a reservation in New Mexico. I saw things there that I have never fully understood. Things that do not fit into our conventional understanding of reality. The people who lived there had names for these entities, had rules about how to interact with them, or more accurately, how to avoid interacting with them. One of the primary rules was this: never look them in the eyes. Eye contact creates a connection, a bridge, and once that bridge is established, they can paralyze you, can hold you in place while they decide whether to ignore you or attack." The narrator asked why the father had never mentioned this before, why they had grown up in this isolated place without being warned about what might be out there. The father sighed. "Because I hoped you would never encounter one," he said. "Because I thought that by not speaking about them, by not giving them attention, I could somehow protect you. Clearly I was wrong." He pulled open a desk drawer and retrieved something the narrator had never seen before, a small wooden disc with a burnt symbol on its surface. He held it out, and the narrator took it automatically, feeling the smooth weight of it in their palm. "A friend gave this to me years ago," the father explained. "He said it offered protection against certain types of entities. I have carried it with me ever since, and I have never needed to use it. But you should have it now. Keep it with you, especially if you go outside after dark." The narrator wanted to ask more questions, wanted to understand what they had seen and why it had appeared in their driveway on Halloween night. But the father made it clear the conversation was over. He deleted the security footage, erasing the evidence of their encounter, and told the narrator they would not discuss this further. "Talking about it invites attention," he said. "The less we focus on it, the less likely it is to return." That night, the narrator lay in bed unable to sleep, replaying the encounter in their mind. They kept seeing those red eyes burning in the darkness, holding them captive with a gaze that felt almost personal, as though the creature had been looking not just at their body but into their essence. The wooden disc sat on the nightstand beside them, and the narrator found themselves reaching out to touch it periodically, drawing some small comfort from its presence. Michael called around 3 in the morning to confirm he had reached Boise safely. His voice was strained, and he told the narrator he had driven the entire way without looking away from the road, terrified that he would see something in his peripheral vision, that the creature would be following him. They spoke for nearly an hour, both of them trying to process what they had witnessed, trying to find some rational explanation that would allow them to sleep. They found none. The narrator and Michael broke up 2 months later. Not because of the incident specifically, but because Michael could not reconcile what he had seen with his understanding of reality, and the cognitive dissonance had made him distant and irritable. He began finding excuses not to visit the narrator's home, and when the narrator visited him in Boise, Michael seemed relieved to have them in the city, surrounded by lights and people and normalcy. Eventually, they both acknowledged that the relationship had been damaged beyond repair by something neither of them could explain or escape. The narrator still lives in that house, helping their aging father maintain the property. They have not seen the creature again, though sometimes late at night they feel watched in ways that have nothing to do with security cameras or human observers. They keep the wooden disc with them always, tucked into a pocket or a purse, and they never go outside after dark without scanning the tree line first, looking for shapes that do not belong, for eyes that burn red in the darkness, because they know now that there are things in the world that exist in the spaces between seen and unseen, things that can hold you captive with nothing but a glance. Things that leave no evidence of their passage but mark everyone who encounters them with a knowledge that can never be unlearned. And on Halloween nights, the narrator stays inside with the doors locked and the curtains drawn, remembering the thing that stood beneath the streetlight and stared at them with eyes like burning coals, and wondering if someday it will return to finish whatever business it left incomplete that cold October night. The narrator was 16 years old when they left the Netherlands to spend a year as an exchange student in the United States. The program had placed them with a host family in rural New Mexico, a landscape so different from their home country that the first few weeks felt like living on another planet entirely. Where the Netherlands was flat and green and organized, New Mexico was all vertical geography, an endless sky, and a wildness that both thrilled and intimidated the narrator. The host family welcomed them warmly, and the narrator quickly developed a bond with the 2 daughters, Sarah, who was also 16, and Emily, who was 14. The family consisted of a father named Robert, a mother named Linda, and the 2 girls. Robert worked as a ranger for the Bureau of Land Management, spending his days managing vast tracts of public land that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. He was a quiet man, thoughtful and competent, the kind of person who communicated more through action than words. Linda taught at the local high school where the narrator attended classes and struggled through the adjustment to American education. The girls were bright and adventurous, eager to show their exchange student sibling everything their strange desert landscape had to offer. When Halloween weekend arrived, Robert suggested they take a camping trip to one of his favorite spots, a remote area about 2 hours from their home where the forest began its transition from desert scrub to pine woodland. The narrator had never been camping before, not in the American sense of driving into wilderness and sleeping in tents miles from civilization. In the Netherlands, camping meant organized sites with bathrooms and designated pitches, not this raw immersion in nature that the Americans seem to embrace so enthusiastically. But the narrator was eager to experience everything their host country offered, and the girls were excited to share this tradition with them, so the narrator agreed without hesitation. They left early Saturday morning, the day before Halloween, driving for hours on highways that narrowed into state roads that eventually became dirt tracks winding through increasingly dense forest. The narrator watched the landscape transform through the car windows, fascinated by the way the trees grew thicker and taller as they gained elevation, the way the air seemed to change quality, becoming crisper and thinner. Robert navigated the rough roads with practiced ease, while Linda pointed out landmarks and wildlife, keeping up a steady stream of information about the ecology of the region. They reached the campsite around noon, pulling into a clearing that showed evidence of previous use but was currently deserted. Robert had chosen this location specifically because of its isolation, he explained. They would likely not see another person all weekend, which meant they could enjoy the wilderness without the intrusion of other campers. The narrator helped set up the tents, following Sarah's patient instructions, and then spent the afternoon exploring the immediate area with the two girls while their parents established the camp more thoroughly. The forest felt ancient in ways that were difficult to articulate. The trees towered overhead, their canopy blocking out much of the sky, and the undergrowth was thick with ferns and fallen logs covered in moss. Sarah pointed out animal tracks in the soft earth, identifying deer and elk and what she thought might be a black bear, though she admitted she was not entirely certain. Emily collected interesting rocks and pine cones, filling her pockets with treasures. The narrator took photographs, trying to capture the strange beauty of this landscape that bore no resemblance to anything they had known growing up. As the afternoon wore into evening, they returned to camp and helped Linda prepare dinner. Robert had brought a portable grill, and they cooked burgers and roasted marshmallows as the sun began its descent behind the western ridges. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared, and the narrator was grateful for the warm jacket Linda had insisted they bring. They sat around the fire as darkness settled over the forest, telling stories and listening to Robert describe some of his experiences working in these remote areas. Around 8 o'clock, the three teenagers decided to explore a bit more before bedtime. Robert gave them permission but made them take flashlights and promised to stay within shouting distance of the camp. They wandered away from the fire, letting their eyes adjust to the darkness, and found a large pine tree with low branches that looked perfect for climbing. Sarah went up first, finding handholds with the confidence of someone who had spent half her life in trees. Emily followed, and the narrator came last, moving more slowly, still getting used to this kind of physical adventure. They settled on branches about 12 feet off the ground, positioned so they could see each other in the dim glow of the campfire through the trees. The forest at night was alive with sounds that the narrator had never heard before, rustlings and distant calls and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Emily started to say something about how peaceful it was when they all heard it. A voice calling the narrator's name. The voice was perfect. It was Emily's voice exactly, with her slight accent and particular cadence, calling the narrator's Dutch name with flawless pronunciation. The narrator turned to look at Emily, intending to ask what she wanted, but the words died before reaching their lips. Emily was staring at them with wide eyes, her hand over her mouth, shaking her head urgently. She had not spoken. Her lips had not moved, but the voice had been hers, unmistakably and impossibly hers. The voice called again, still using Emily's voice, still speaking the narrator's name, but this time it came from deeper in the forest, perhaps 50 yards from their position. The narrator felt their skin go cold despite the warm jacket. Sarah reached out and grabbed the narrator's arm, her grip painfully tight, her face pale even in the poor light. All three of them sat frozen, listening as the voice called a third time, even farther away now, moving deeper into the darkness between the trees. Then the narrator saw movement. Something was walking through the forest, weaving between the trees with a fluid grace that seemed wrong somehow. The shape was roughly human-sized, but moved in a way that humans did not, too smooth, without the normal bob and sway of walking. The narrator's flashlight was in their pocket, but they were terrified to turn it on. Some instinct warning them that drawing attention would be catastrophic. The voice called again, and this time all three of them could see exactly where it was coming from. The shape had stopped about 30 yards from their tree, standing in a small gap between pines where starlight provided minimal illumination. It was tall and thin, with proportions that were not quite right. Arms too long and legs that bent at an angle that made the narrator's stomach turn. And as they watched, it called the narrator's name again in Emily's perfect voice. The sound emerging from something that was definitely not Emily. Sarah moved first, climbing down from the tree with reckless speed, not bothering with handholds, half falling the last few feet. Emily followed immediately, and the narrator scrambled after them, their heart hammering so violently they thought they might be sick. They hit the ground and ran, all three of them sprinting through the darkness toward the distant glow of the campfire, branches whipping at their faces, roots threatening to trip them with every step. Behind them, the voice called again, but it was different now. It had lost Emily's inflection and had become something else. Something that tried to sound human but failed in subtle, terrible ways. It called the narrator's name over and over, following them through the forest, always at the same distance, never getting closer but never falling behind. They burst into the clearing where their parents sat by the fire, all three of them gasping for breath, terror written across their faces. Robert was on his feet instantly, demanding to know what happened, his hand moving to the rifle the narrator had not realized he kept near his chair. Linda stood as well, her face shifting from concern to alarm as she took in their panic. Sarah tried to explain, her words tumbling over each other incoherently, gesturing toward the forest and saying something about a voice and a shape. Emily had begun to cry, shaking violently, unable to speak. The narrator stood with their hands on their knees, trying to catch their breath, trying to make sense of what they had just experienced. Robert's entire demeanor changed. The color drained from his face, and he looked at Linda with an expression that conveyed an entire conversation without words. Linda nodded once and immediately began moving around the camp with purposeful efficiency, grabbing essential items and stuffing them into bags. Robert turned to the three teenagers and spoke in a voice that was calm but absolutely firm. "We are leaving, right now. Do not ask questions, do not argue, just get in the car." They packed the camp in under 5 minutes, abandoning anything that was not essential, working with the kind of coordinated urgency that spoke of previous planning and practice. The narrator helped load gear into the car while glancing nervously at the tree line, expecting at any moment to see that shape emerge from the darkness or hear that terrible voice calling their name. But the forest had gone silent. No animal sounds, no wind, just an oppressive quiet that felt like held breath. They drove away from the campsite at a speed that was probably dangerous on the rough dirt roads. Robert's hands tight on the wheel, his eyes fixed forward. No one spoke during the long drive home. The girls sat on either side of the narrator in the back seat, and the narrator could feel them trembling, could hear Emily's occasional sniffles as she fought to control her tears. Linda kept her hand on Robert's shoulder, a gesture of support or perhaps restraint, the narrator could not tell which. They reached the house around midnight. Linda immediately made hot chocolate and sat the three teenagers down at the kitchen table while Robert paced in the living room, occasionally looking out the windows as though checking for something in the darkness. The narrator wanted to ask what had happened, why they had fled so urgently, what that thing in the forest had been. but Sarah and Emily sat in shell-shocked silence, and the narrator sensed that pushing for answers would be unwelcome. Finally, 2 days later, as Robert drove the narrator to the airport for a previously planned trip to visit other exchange students in California, he broke his silence. "What you heard in the forest," he said carefully, his eyes on the road, "is something that the people who have lived on this land for thousands of years have many names for. In Navajo culture, they are sometimes called Ye-Nald-Lushi, though using that name is considered dangerous. They are shapeshifters, witches who can take the form of animals, and one of their most terrifying abilities is voice mimicry. They can perfectly replicate the voice of someone you know and trust, and they use that ability to lure people away from safety, deeper into the wilderness where no one will hear them scream." The narrator listened in stunned silence as Robert continued. "The reason we left so quickly," he explained, "is because once you have been targeted by one, once it has focused its attention on you specifically, remaining in that location is extremely dangerous. The best thing to do is leave immediately and create as much distance as possible. I have worked in these lands for 20 years, and I have heard stories, seen things I cannot explain. But I have never before had one approach my campsite so directly, so aggressively. Something about your presence drew it in, though I cannot say what or why." He glanced at the narrator briefly before returning his attention to the road. "You cannot speak about this," he said firmly. "Not to friends back home, not to family, not to anyone. There are rules about these entities, and one of the most important is silence. Talking about them, naming them, giving them attention can invite further encounters. Do you understand?" The narrator nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Robert reached over and squeezed their shoulder once, a gesture of comfort and solidarity. "You were very lucky," he said quietly. "All three of you were lucky. If you had followed that voice, if you had climbed down from that tree and walked deeper into the forest, I do not believe we would have found you, at least not in any condition that would have mattered." The narrator returned to the Netherlands at the end of the school year and never went back to New Mexico. They have maintained contact with Sarah and Emily through social media and occasional emails, but none of them have ever discussed what happened that Halloween weekend. The narrator knows without being told that the girls carry the same unspoken agreement, the same understanding that some experiences are too dangerous to examine too closely, too frightening to transform into narrative. But sometimes, late at night, the narrator hears their name being called in a voice that sounds exactly like someone they love, and they remember the thing in the forest that wore Emily's voice like a mask, and they stay very still and very quiet until the voice finally goes away. The narrator was 12 years old the first time they understood that fear could be absolute, could strip away every layer of civilization and rational thought and reduce a person to nothing but the screaming animal instinct to survive. Before that Halloween night, fear had been a concept, something experienced in controlled doses during scary movies or the brief startle of a spider appearing unexpectedly. After that night, the narrator understood that true fear was something entirely different, something that could mark a person permanently and change the way they moved through the world. The narrator grew up in rural Alabama, where the woods pressed close against every property line and darkness was a tangible presence rather than simply the absence of light. The narrator's best friend at that time was a boy named Danny who lived 3 houses down the dirt road that connected their small cluster of homes. Danny and the narrator were inseparable that summer and fall, spending every available moment exploring the woods, building forts, and planning elaborate adventures that never quite materialized beyond the planning stage. When Halloween arrived, Danny had the brilliant idea that they should camp in the narrator's backyard to celebrate. Not in the woods themselves, Danny was not that reckless, but in the open field that separated the narrator's house from the tree line, about 500 yards of cleared land that felt simultaneously safe and adventurous. The narrator's parents agreed with the caveat that the boys had to stay within sight of the house and had to come inside if anything went wrong. The narrator and Danny spent the afternoon setting up a tent, gathering firewood and preparing supplies with the kind of meticulous attention that 12-year-olds bring to projects they consider monumentally important. They settled in as darkness fell, building their fire with perhaps more enthusiasm than skill, creating a blaze that was far too large and consumed their carefully gathered wood at an alarming rate. But they were proud of their independence, of this small taste of wilderness survival, and they sat beside their bonfire eating snacks and telling each other stories they had heard from older kids at school, competing to see who could be more frightening. Around 10 o'clock they heard the scream. It came from deep within the woods, a sound unlike anything the narrator had ever encountered. It was not an animal sound, at least not any animal the narrator could identify. And it was not quite human either. It fell somewhere in between, a shriek that climbed in pitch until it seemed impossible that any throat could produce such a noise, and then cut off abruptly, leaving a silence that felt somehow worse than the sound itself. The narrator and Danny looked at each other across the fire, both of them frozen. "What was that?" Danny whispered. The narrator shook their head, unable to answer. They waited, listening intently, but the sound did not repeat. Eventually, Danny suggested it had probably been a fox or maybe an owl, that the woods played tricks with sound and made normal animals seem strange. The narrator wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, so they agreed and tried to return to their previous conversation. But the evening had been spoiled. The darkness beyond their firelight now seemed threatening rather than exciting, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made both boys jump. They moved closer to the fire, drawing what comfort they could from its light and warmth, and talked in quieter voices as though afraid of drawing attention to themselves. Around midnight, the fire began to die. They had burned through all their wood, and neither boy wanted to venture to the woodpile near the house to get more, though neither would admit this to the other. They watched the flames shrink, the circle of light growing smaller, the darkness pressing closer. The narrator suggested they should probably go inside, but Danny protested that this would be admitting defeat, that they would look like scared children if they gave up on their camping adventure after just a few hours. They were still debating this when the narrator saw the shadow. It moved across their field of vision so quickly that they almost dismissed it as imagination, a trick of the failing firelight. But then it passed again, between the tent and the fire, a shape that blocked the light for just a fraction of a second, but was unmistakably there. The narrator grabbed Danny's arm and pointed, but the shadow had already disappeared. They sat in rigid silence, both of them staring into the darkness, waiting for the shape to appear again. The fire had diminished to glowing coals now, providing almost no illumination, and the narrator realized with growing terror that they could no longer see the house. The distance that had seemed so small during daylight had become an impossible expanse of darkness, and the narrator had no confidence they could navigate it without stumbling or getting lost or running directly into whatever was circling their campsite. Because something was definitely circling. The narrator could hear it now, a soft dragging sound moving through the grass, going around their tent in a slow, deliberate pattern. Around and around, never stopping, never coming closer, but never moving away either. The narrator wanted to scream, wanted to run, wanted to do anything but sit there paralyzed by fear, but their body refused to obey. Beside them, Danny had begun to cry softly, trying to muffle the sound with his hand. The narrator made a decision. They grabbed their sleeping bag and pulled it over their head, blocking out everything, choosing the suffocating darkness inside the bag over the terror of watching the shadows move outside. They could still hear the dragging sound, could track its movement around the tent by sound alone, but at least they could not see it, could not watch whatever was out there making its slow, patient circuit. The narrator must have fallen asleep eventually, though they had no memory of the transition. One moment they were listening to that terrible dragging sound, heart-hammering, lungs straining for air inside the sleeping bag, and the next moment they were waking to sunlight and Danny shaking their shoulder. The narrator emerged from the sleeping bag gasping, looking around wildly, but everything appeared normal. The tent still stood, the fire had gone completely cold, and the morning sun illuminated an empty field showing no signs of disturbance. Danny looked exhausted, his face pale and eyes red-rimmed. "Did you hear that last night?" he asked. The narrator nodded. "We should go inside," Danny said, and the narrator agreed immediately. They left the tent and all their camping gear where it stood and walked to the house, both of them glancing back repeatedly to make sure nothing was following them. The narrator's parents asked how the camping trip had gone, and the narrator lied, saying it had been fun but cold, and they had decided to come in early. The parents accepted this without question, and the narrator and Danny spent the rest of the day inside, neither of them willing to venture into the backyard until the narrator's father went out in the late afternoon to disassemble the tent and bring in their abandoned gear. The narrator did not camp again for years. The experience had poisoned something, had turned what should have been an adventure into a source of anxiety. And over time, the narrator began to convince themselves that nothing had really happened, that they and Danny had simply scared themselves with stories and imagination, that the scream had been an animal, and the shadow had been a trick of the failing firelight. But then, years later, the narrator stumbled across an online forum where people shared strange experiences from rural Alabama. Multiple users described hearing screams in the woods near the narrator's childhood home, sounds that did not match any known animal. Others reported seeing figures moving through fields at night, shapes that vanished when approached. An elderly man who lived in the area posted a long, detailed account of something he had seen at the edge of his property, something that walked on two legs but was neither man nor animal, something that watched his house for hours before finally retreating into the woods. The narrator read these accounts with a growing sense of vindication and renewed fear. What they had experienced that Halloween night had been real. The scream, the shadow, the circling presence, all of it had been genuine. And the most terrifying part was that whatever had been out there had chosen not to approach closer, had simply circled their tent for hours watching, waiting, perhaps deciding whether they were worth the effort. The narrator contacted Danny, whom they had not spoken to in nearly a decade, and asked if he remembered that Halloween camping trip. Danny's response was immediate and unambiguous. "I will never forget it. Every Halloween since then, I stay inside with the doors locked. I do not care if people think I am crazy. I know what I heard. I know what was out there." They talked for hours, comparing memories, confirming details, validating each other's experiences. Both of them had carried that night with them for years. Both of them had been marked by it in ways they were only beginning to understand. Danny confessed that he had never told anyone else about what happened, afraid that people would dismiss him as imaginative or attention-seeking. The narrator admitted the same. Now, as an adult, the narrator understands that the woods near their childhood home harbor something that defies easy explanation. Other people have seen it, heard it, been terrorized by it. There is a pattern to the encounters, a consistency that suggests something genuinely inhabits those forests, something that occasionally ventures to the edges where wilderness meets civilization and watches the humans who have built their lives there. The narrator has never returned to that property. Their parents moved years ago and the house has changed hands multiple times since then. But sometimes, late at night, the narrator wakes from dreams of sitting beside a dying fire, listening to something circle their tent in the darkness, and they pull the covers over their head just as they did when they were 12 years old, seeking the false safety of manufactured darkness while something patient and unknowable makes its slow circuit through the shadows outside. The narrator's Uncle Mark has always been a man of few words, someone who keeps his experiences close and shares them only when circumstances demand it. So when he called the narrator on Halloween night 3 years ago, his voice shaking with something that might have been fear or rage or both, the narrator knew immediately that something catastrophic had occurred. Mark had just returned from a hunting trip to northern Minnesota near the Canadian border, and what he described during that phone call fundamentally changed the way the narrator understood the world. Mark owned a cabin in one of the most remote areas of the state, accessible only by a logging road that was barely maintained and impassable for much of the winter. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the nearest town was 30 miles beyond that. Mark loved the isolation, the complete severance from modern life, the way the silence of the deep woods could make a person feel simultaneously insignificant and profoundly connected to something ancient. He spent several weeks there every fall, hunting and fishing and simply existing in a landscape that had changed little since the glaciers retreated 10,000 years ago. The narrator had been invited on this particular trip, but had declined due to work obligations, a decision they would later recognize as either tremendous luck or divine intervention. Mark had gone alone, arriving at the cabin on October 28th to prepare for the opening of hunting season. The cabin was primitive, a single room with a wood stove for heat, a propane camp stove for cooking, and no electricity or running water. Mark preferred it that way, considered modern conveniences a distraction from the purity of the wilderness experience. The first 2 nights passed uneventfully. Mark spent his days scouting the surrounding forest, identifying game trails and likely deer stands, and his evenings reading by lantern light and listening to the sounds of the forest settling into autumn. On Halloween night, the temperature dropped precipitously, plummeting to negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill an unprepared person in minutes, cold enough to make the trees crack and groan like artillery fire. Mark had driven into the nearest town that afternoon to pick up supplies, a 3-hour round trip that left him returning to the cabin well after dark. He stoked the wood stove until it roared, heating the small space to a temperature that was almost uncomfortable, and settled in for the evening with a book and a thermos of coffee. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees with a sound like distant screaming, and Mark remembered feeling grateful for the solid walls of the cabin and the warmth of the fire. Around 9 o'clock, Mark heard something outside. At first he thought it was the wind, but as he listened more carefully, he realized it was a dragging sound, something heavy being pulled through the snow that had accumulated over the previous days. The sound circled the cabin slowly, and Mark felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Bears should have been hibernating by then, and no other animal he knew would make that particular sound, that deliberate, purposeful dragging. The sound stopped at the window that faced the forest. Mark sat frozen, listening to the silence, knowing with absolute certainty that something was standing just outside, separated from him by only a single pane of glass and perhaps 3 feet of space. He waited, barely breathing, and then it knocked. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the window, knuckles against glass, perfectly spaced, unmistakably intentional. Mark grabbed his flashlight and aimed it at the window, his hand shaking badly enough that the beam wavered. What he saw in that brief moment of illumination would haunt him for the rest of his life. A figure stood beyond the glass, impossibly tall, perhaps 7 or 8 feet, emaciated to the point where its ribs were clearly visible through skin that looked blackened and frostbitten. Its limbs were too long, arms that hung nearly to its knees, and its face was a nightmare of wrong proportions, eyes too large and space too far apart, glowing with a dim red light like dying embers. But it was the mouth that truly terrified Mark, stretched into a smile that was far too wide, revealing teeth that were sharp and numerous and stained dark with something Mark desperately hoped was not blood. The creature spoke. Its voice was wrong, layered with multiple tones that should not have been able to come from a single throat, garbled and wet and somehow mocking. "Let me in," it said. "So cold out here. Let me in." Mark stumbled backward, nearly falling over the chair behind him, the flashlight beam swinging wildly before he managed to shut it off completely. In the sudden darkness, he could hear his own breathing, ragged and panicked, and underneath that, a scratching sound on the window, fingernails or claws dragging across the glass in a pattern that might have been playful if it was not so deeply threatening. "Let me in," the voice said again, and this time it sounded almost petulant, like a child denied a treat. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Mark knew the window would not hold if the creature decided to force entry. Knew that the old glass and rotting wood frame would shatter under any real pressure. He grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the wall, chambering around with shaking hands, and aimed it at the window even though he could not see the creature anymore. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been, pregnant with potential violence, and Mark stood there with the rifle raised, his shoulders burning from the strain of holding it ready, waiting for the crash of breaking glass that would signal the creature's entry. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time became meaningless in that state of heightened terror, and still Mark did not lower the rifle, did not dare to move or breathe deeply or do anything that might attract the creature's attention back to him. Then the dragging sound started again, moving away from the window, circling the cabin in the opposite direction. It made a complete circuit, slow and methodical, and Mark turned in place, following the sound with his rifle, trying to anticipate where the creature might strike next. But it continued around the cabin without stopping, completing one full circle, then another, then a third. Mark lost count after a while, focusing all his energy on simply remaining standing, remaining alert, keeping the rifle ready. The circling continued until dawn. Mark knew this because he watched through a gap in the curtains as the sky gradually lightened from black to dark blue to the pale gray of a winter morning. As the first real sunlight touched the trees, the dragging sound simply stopped. No gradual fading, no sound of the creature retreating into the forest, just an abrupt cessation that left Mark standing in the middle of his cabin, exhausted and traumatized and utterly alone. He waited until the sun was fully up before he dared to move. His legs had gone numb from standing so long in one position, and he nearly fell when he tried to take a step. He set the rifle down carefully and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain with trembling hands. The snow outside was pristine and unmarked. No tracks, no drag marks, no indication that anything had been there at all. The impossibility of this nearly broke him because Mark knew what he had heard, knew what he had seen, and the absence of evidence made it somehow more terrifying rather than less. He packed his belongings with frantic speed, throwing clothes and supplies into bags without any organization, desperate only to leave, to put distance between himself and whatever had visited him during the night. He loaded everything into his truck and drove away without looking back, navigating the treacherous logging road at speeds that were dangerous but necessary, fleeing towards civilization and safety and witnesses who could confirm that he was real and solid and not trapped in some nightmare from which he could not wake. Mark sold the cabin the following month, never returning to retrieve the possessions he had left behind in his panicked departure. He sold it at a significant loss to the first buyer who showed interest, a young couple from Minneapolis looking for a wilderness retreat, and he did not warn them about what he had encountered. The narrator asked him about this later, asked how he could sell the property to unsuspecting people knowing what might be waiting there, and Mark's response was chilling in its honesty. "What could I have told them?" he asked. "That something impossibly tall had knocked on my window and asked to be let in? That it had circled my cabin for hours, leaving no tracks in the snow? They would have thought I was insane, and maybe they would have been right to think so. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that if I had opened that door, if I had let that thing inside, I would not be here talking to you now." The narrator asked what Mark thought the creature was, what explanation he had constructed to make sense of the encounter. Mark was quiet for a long time before answering. "I worked as a missionary in Arizona when I was younger," he finally said. "I spent time on a Navajo reservation. And I heard stories there about things that walk the night, things that can take the shape of animals or humans, things that survive the cold and the heat and the passage of time. The locals had names for these entities, but they would not speak those names aloud, said that naming them was an invitation. I do not know if what I saw that night was one of those things, but I know it was not natural, was not bound by the same rules that govern normal life, and I know that it asked to be let in, which suggests it needed permission, needed to be invited across the threshold." The narrator asked what would have happened if Mark had opened the door, and Mark's response was immediate and unequivocal. "I would be dead," he said. "Or worse than dead. There are fates that transcend simple mortality, and I think that thing was offering one of them." The narrator's uncle Mark had served a mission for his church in Arizona during his early 20s, an experience he rarely discussed and never romanticized. The narrator always sensed that something had happened during those 2 years, something that had fundamentally altered Mark's relationship with faith and wilderness, and the unseen forces that moved through both. It was only years later, after the incident at his Minnesota cabin, that Mark finally shared the full story of his time on the reservation and what he and his companion Carl had faced during their assignment there. Mark and Carl had been assigned to work among the communities scattered across the Navajo Nation, a territory that sprawled across parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. Their mission president had warned them that the work would be difficult, that the people there held ancient beliefs that often conflicted with the message they were bringing, and that they should expect resistance and isolation. What the president had not warned them about, because he likely did not believe it himself, was that some of those ancient beliefs were rooted in genuine encounters with forces that defied rational explanation. The church had housed them in a trailer on the outskirts of one of the reservation communities, a small aluminum structure that had seen better decades and leaked heat like a sieve during the cold desert nights. Mark and Carl settled in quickly, establishing routines and beginning their outreach work, meeting with families and offering service, and slowly building relationships in a culture that had little reason to trust outsiders bearing religious messages. The trouble started on their first night. Mark was awakened around 2 in the morning by a violent shaking, as though the trailer were being pushed back and forth by multiple people. The entire structure rocked on its foundation, the aluminum walls flexing and groaning under the pressure. Mark sat up in his bed, disoriented and frightened, and saw Carl doing the same across the narrow space that separated their bunks. The shaking continued for perhaps 30 seconds, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. They waited in the darkness, listening, but heard nothing outside. No voices, no footsteps, no indication of who or what had shaken their trailer. Carl suggested it might have been an earthquake, but Mark had experienced earthquakes before, and this had felt different, more targeted, more intentional. They eventually went back to sleep, though both of them lay awake for hours, listening for any repetition of the disturbance. The shaking became a nightly occurrence. Every night between midnight and 3 in the morning, the trailer would rock violently, as though being pushed from both sides simultaneously. The pattern was always the same. Sudden, violent shaking that lasted between 20 seconds and a minute, then complete silence. Mark and Carl tried everything they could think of to identify the source. They took turns keeping watch, but whoever was on watch would see and hear nothing, even as the trailer shook around them. They inspected the exterior, looking for footprints or any sign of tampering, but found nothing. When they mentioned the disturbances to local families, the response was immediate and disturbing. Conversations that had been warm and welcoming turned cold and distant. Doors that had been open to them were suddenly closed. One woman, who had been particularly friendly, pulled Mark aside and told him in a harsh whisper that they needed to leave the reservation immediately, that they were discussing things that should not be spoken of, and that their continued presence was putting everyone at risk. Mark and Carl went to their mission president with their concerns, explaining the nightly disturbances and the hostile reaction from the community. The president was skeptical, suggesting they were experiencing some natural phenomenon they did not understand, perhaps wind or settling of the old trailer on its foundation. He told them to pray more fervently and to avoid discussing their accommodations with the locals, as it seemed to be causing unnecessary friction. Frustrated and exhausted from weeks of disrupted sleep, Carl decided to confront whatever was causing the disturbances. On Halloween night, as the shaking began, he walked to the trailer door and threw it open, shouting into the darkness for whoever was out there to show themselves. Mark watched from his bed, too stunned to stop him, as Carl stood in the doorway staring into the night. The shaking stopped immediately. Carl stood there for a long moment, and Mark could see his companion's posture change, could see the way he went rigid and still in a manner that suggested not courage but paralysis. Then Carl stepped backward into the trailer and slammed the door, his face drained of color, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn the lock. "He saw them," Carl whispered. "3 of them. 2 wolves and a bear, but not right. They had human shapes to them, human postures. And while Mark watched, all 3 stood upright on their hind legs like people and walked slowly toward the tree line, making sounds that were not animal sounds but human laughter, cackling and mocking and filled with malicious amusement. They requested a transfer the next morning, and the mission president, perhaps sensing genuine trauma in their demeanor, granted it immediately. They were relocated to a different area far from the reservation, and new missionaries were sent to take their place. Mark later learned that those new missionaries had lasted exactly 3 nights before also requesting transfer, citing disturbances they could not explain and would not describe in detail. But the story did not end with the transfer. A year later, Mark had been reassigned to work in a different part of Arizona, training a new missionary named Jimmy who had just arrived from Utah. The mission president asked Mark to transport Jimmy from the mission home to his new assignment, a drive that would take them through the edge of the reservation Mark had left a year earlier. Mark tried to argue, tried to suggest an alternate route, but the president was insistent that this was the most direct path and time was a consideration. Mark reluctantly agreed, planning to make the drive during daylight hours to avoid any potential encounters. But car trouble delayed their departure, and by the time they were on the road, night had fallen completely. They were perhaps 20 miles into the reservation, driving along a 2-lane highway with forest pressing close on both sides, when Jimmy suddenly pointed out the window and asked what that was. Mark looked in the direction Jimmy indicated and saw something running alongside their car, keeping pace despite the fact that Mark was driving over 60 miles per hour. It was enormous, easily 7 feet tall even while running on all 4s, shaped like a wolf but impossibly large and running in a manner that defied natural locomotion. As Mark watched in horror, the creature rose onto its hind legs while maintaining its speed, running upright like a human, its front limbs pumping like arms. Its massive head turned toward the car as though studying the occupants. Mark pressed the accelerator to the floor, pushing the car to speeds that were dangerous on the winding road. but the creature kept pace effortlessly. It ran alongside them for nearly 10 minutes, sometimes dropping to all fours, sometimes rising upright, sometimes falling behind only to surge forward again, demonstrating an endurance and speed that was impossible for any natural animal. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature veered off the road and vanished into the trees. Mark drove for another hour at maximum speed, not slowing until they had left the reservation entirely and reached the relative safety of a larger town. Jimmy sat in stunned silence the entire time, occasionally asking questions that Mark could not answer, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. Mark finished his mission 3 months later and returned home, vowing never to return to Arizona or any area adjacent to the reservation. He kept that vow for decades, turning down job opportunities and vacation invitations that would have taken him anywhere near that region. He never spoke publicly about what he had experienced, knowing that most people would dismiss his account as hallucination or exaggeration or outright fabrication. But the narrator believed him, because Mark had never been prone to fantasy or attention-seeking, because the trauma in his voice when he recounted these experiences was genuine and deep, and because the narrator had learned through their own research that Mark's encounters followed patterns reported by dozens of other people who had spent time on or near the reservation. The shaking trailers, the animal-human hybrids, the impossible speed and endurance. All of it appeared in account after account from people who had no connection to each other and no reason to coordinate their stories. Mark told the narrator that the experience had taught him something important about the nature of reality, about the arrogance of assuming that modern science and rational thought could explain every phenomenon. There are older forces in the world, he said. Forces that were here long before humans arrived and will likely remain long after humans are gone. We built our civilizations on top of their territories and convinced ourselves that because we could not see them, they must not exist. But they exist. And occasionally they remind us that we are guests in their world, not the other way around. The narrator is 1/4 Navajo, a heritage that comes with stories and warnings and a cultural knowledge that most of their peers do not possess. The narrator's grandmother, a full-blooded Navajo woman who married outside her tribe and moved away from the reservation, maintained the old traditions and beliefs even as she adapted to suburban life. She taught the narrator from a young age that there were things in the world that did not belong in polite conversation, entities that thrived on attention and grew stronger when people spoke their names aloud. The narrator learned to listen more than they spoke, to observe patterns that others dismissed, and to trust their instincts when something felt fundamentally wrong. Every summer during childhood, the narrator would stay with their uncle at his 3-story house on the outskirts of Flagstaff, Arizona. The house was old, built in the early 1900s with high ceilings and creaking floors and a basement that had been converted into a living space complete with a television and couches and large windows that looked out at ground level. The narrator loved those visits, loved the freedom of exploring the large property and spending time with their cousins and aunt. But they had always felt uneasy about the basement. The discomfort was not rational. The basement was well lit and furnished comfortably, showing no signs of dampness or decay or any of the usual reasons people fear underground spaces. But something about it made the narrator's skin crawl, made them hyper-aware of the windows that remained open at night, the way those windows were large enough for a person to climb through, and the fact that the basement was where guests always slept, isolated from the rest of the family on the upper floors. The narrator had seen things before, had encountered entities that their non-native friends dismissed as impossible. They knew that their heritage made them more visible to certain forces, that blood carried awareness in both directions, and that being part Navajo meant being part of a world that existed alongside but separate from mainstream American reality. So when the narrator arrived for their summer visit the year they turned 15 and felt that familiar dread about sleeping in the basement intensified to a degree they had never experienced before, they knew something was wrong. The first few nights passed without incident, though the narrator slept poorly, waking frequently with the sensation of being watched. The windows remained open to let in the cool night air, and the narrator would lie in the darkness staring at those rectangles of lesser darkness, watching for movement, listening for sounds that did not belong. Their aunt slept on a pull-out couch on the opposite side of the room, her presence providing some comfort but not enough to overcome the narrator's growing anxiety. On Halloween night, the narrator woke at 1 a.m. for no reason they could identify. The room was dark and quiet, the only sound the gentle breathing of their aunt across the room. But something had pulled the narrator from sleep, some instinct screaming that danger was present and immediate. They lay perfectly still, afraid to move, scanning the darkness for whatever had triggered their alarm. Then they saw their aunt, or rather they saw what they thought was their aunt, lying on the couch beside them rather than across the room where she had gone to sleep. The figure had long black hair spread across the pillow, and the narrator's first thought was confusion about when their aunt had moved. But then the narrator's eyes adjusted further to the darkness, and they could see their aunt still sleeping on the far couch exactly where she was supposed to be. The narrator's blood went cold. There were 2 figures in the room where there should only have been 1. They turned their heads slowly, terrified of drawing attention but unable to stop themselves from looking at whatever was lying beside them. The figure was humanoid, approximately the size and shape of an adult woman, with hair that might have been black or might have been the absence of light made solid. But as the narrator stared, they noticed the joints were wrong. Where a human elbow should bend one way, this thing's joint bent the opposite direction. A subtle wrongness that made the narrator's stomach turn. Adrenaline flooded the narrator's system. Without thinking, without planning, they flipped backward over the couch in a single motion, their body moving with a speed and coordination that surprise and terror can sometimes produce. They hit the floor on the other side and scrambled to their feet, making enough noise to wake their aunt, who sat up confused and alarmed. The figure on the couch moved. It did not stand or roll off or perform any normal human movement. Instead, it flowed, its body moving with a snake-like undulation, sliding off the couch and gliding toward the open window with a grace that was utterly inhuman. Within seconds, it had passed through the window and disappeared into the night, moving so smoothly it seemed to pour out of the room like liquid shadow. The aunt demanded to know what was happening, but the narrator could not speak, could not form words around the terror that gripped their throat. They simply pointed at the window, shaking, and their aunt, who knew enough about the family's heritage to understand without explanation, immediately got up and closed all the windows, locking them with hands that trembled only slightly. They did not speak about it that night. The aunt made tea and they sat together in the basement until dawn, both of them understanding instinctively that discussing what had happened while darkness still held power was dangerous. When morning finally arrived, they went upstairs to find the grandmother already awake, making breakfast with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she knew something had occurred. The grandmother listened to the narrator's account without interruption, her face growing more serious with each detail. When the narrator finished, the grandmother nodded slowly and asked them to wait. She disappeared into her bedroom and emerged holding a small leather pouch that the narrator had seen before but never been allowed to touch. She opened it and removed several items, herbs that the narrator could not identify, a small stone carved with symbols and a length of red cord. What the grandmother did next, she did in privacy, sending the narrator and aunt out of the basement while she performed whatever ritual or blessing she considered necessary. The narrator waited upstairs with growing impatience, wanting to know what was being done, what protection was being established. After an hour, the grandmother emerged and declared the space cleansed and warded, and that it should be safe now. But the narrator did not feel safe. They spent the rest of their visit sleeping upstairs in a small guest room, refusing to return to the basement despite their grandmother's assurances. And late one night, unable to sleep, the narrator overheard their grandmother and aunt talking in hushed voices in the kitchen. The grandmother was explaining that this was not the first intrusion, that something had been testing the family's defenses for years, and that the narrator's blood made them a target of particular interest. The aunt asked about another incident, something that had happened years earlier when the narrator's younger brother was a baby. The grandmother's voice dropped even lower, but the narrator caught fragments. Locks found on the floor despite being secure when everyone went to bed, exterior doors standing wide open in the morning, and most disturbing, a lock of the baby brother's hair cut cleanly while he slept, despite both parents sleeping in the same room and hearing nothing during the night. The grandmother had performed a protection ritual then as well, one that had apparently held for several years until the narrator's visit had somehow drawn attention back to the household. The grandmother's voice carried a mixture of frustration and resignation as she explained that some families carry spiritual weight across generations, that their bloodline made them visible to entities that most people would never encounter, and that vigilance was not paranoia, but necessary survival. The narrator never stayed in that house again. Future visits were conducted as day trips, and when the narrator's uncle eventually sold the property and moved to a different state, no one in the family expressed regret. The narrator's grandmother passed away 2 years later, taking with her the specific knowledge of how to perform the protective rituals, though she had taught the narrator enough to understand the basic principles. Never speak the names of dangerous entities, never invite anything across your threshold, and trust that blood knows what the mind might deny. Now in their 30s, the narrator has children of their own, and they watch for signs that the same sensitivity might have passed to the next generation. They teach their children the importance of locked windows and doors, of trusting instinct over logic when something feels wrong, of respecting the old ways even when modern life makes them seem irrelevant. Because the narrator knows from direct experience that there are things that slide through open windows in the night, things that lie beside sleeping people and study them with intentions that are never benign, things that can be held at bay through vigilance and ritual but never truly eliminated. The narrator carries a small leather pouch now, similar to the one their grandmother owned, filled with items they hope never to use but keep close anyway, just in case the thing that visited them that Halloween night decides to return and finish whatever purpose had brought it into their presence all those years ago.